The night air in the old American village carried a strange silence, the kind that made even the dogs restless and the fires burn lower than usual. It was a time when the forest still pressed close against the edge of the settlement, when the cry of an owl or the snap of a branch could remind every soul how fragile life was in the wilderness. The river ran dark and slow beyond the trees, and the moonlight glimmered on its surface like a blade. People spoke in hushed voices after sundown, fearful of stirring old spirits or waking the dangers that lay just beyond the firelight. Yet, in the heart of this quiet village, the story of a man whose heart was torn between duty to his people and a forbidden desire that burned hotter than the flames. In the council's fire pit, he was not an ordinary man in the tribe. He carried the weight of tradition on his shoulders. His wife, patient and proud, had stood by his side through harsh winters, through years of hunger and war, through the endless struggle of keeping their people strong. Yet even as she remained loyal, there was something he could not confess to, or something he buried beneath his solemn expression and the chants of nightly prayers. For in a small wooden hut on the far edge of the village, hidden from the eyes of many, lived a woman unlike any his people had ever known. She was not one of them. She was his prisoner. The story of how she came to be there was told differently depending on who spoke of it, some said. She had wandered too far from a distant settlement, captured in the thickets by young hunters eager to prove themselves. Others whispered she had been stolen in revenge for a raid, a living trophy taken so that grief could be balanced by possession. Whatever the truth, she became part of their world, though never welcomed. The women looked at her with distrust, and the elders spoke of her as a dangerous omen. She was fed, clothed in rough skins, and watched carefully, but never treated as one of their own. To most, she was simply the white prisoner and outsider, whose presence was a reminder of conflict between their world and the encroaching one beyond the forest. But to him, the chief, she was more than a prisoner. Time he saw her, trembling yet defiant in the flickering glow of the fire, something stirred in him that he could not put to rest. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more the strangeness of her features, the unfamiliar lilt of her voice. Yet as days became weeks, and weeks turned into long months, he found himself drawn to the hut more often than he should have. Ben. He spoke to her in the quiet hours, when no other ears could hear. He studied her eyes when she looked at him with both fear and a strange kind of courage. And in those moments, he felt a dangerous pull inside him, one that no tradition or duty could smother, his wife noticed, though she never spoke of it. She saw the way his gaze shifted when her husband returned late from his rounds. She saw how his voice softened when he thought no one else was listening. She felt the distance growing between them like a shadow. Yet in the code of the tribe, silence was safer than suspicion, and so she swallowed her questions, choosing to guard her dignity rather than stir open conflict. But her silence was not enough to keep the peace forever. For others, too, began to sense that something was wrong. Their leader's heart was not fully with them. The village itself seemed to carry the weight of the secret. Nights grew heavier, fires burned with uneasy crackles, and the warriors muttered of bad omens when their hunts failed. Children woke from dreams they could not explain, crying of strange faces in the woods. The elders gathered more often, beating their drums in ceremonies meant to drive away the unrest. Still, nothing eased the air of tension that clung to them. And at the center of it all, though none dared to speak it aloud, was the pale stranger. And the forbidden bond that had begun to take root between her and their chief, it was not love as others understood it. It was a hunger tangled with fascination, a need that eroded reason the way water eats its stone. Why, to him, the white prisoner represented something beyond tradition, beyond even the duties that bound him to his people. She was freedom from expectation, a dangerous taste of what he was never meant to have. And with each night, he lingered near her, speaking words that strayed further from caution. He knew he was drawing closer to a point from which there would be no return. The wife, torn between loyalty and dread, prayed for her husband's heart to return to her. She offered food to the spirits, whispered chants into the smoke of the fire. and waited in silence for the man she once knew to come back. Yet deep down, she feared that he had already crossed a line invisible but unbreakable. For once the chief's desire became stronger than his devotion, the tribe itself would feel the break. A leader's heart did not belong to himself alone. It belonged to every man, woman, and child under his care. And if he failed them, his failure would ripple outward, shattering more than his own household. The prisoner, too, felt the weight of his gaze. She knew she was trapped in a place where freedom was a dream too fragile to name. Yet in the strange rhythm of her days, as she saw the way he returned again and again, she began to feel a shift she did not understand. Fear was still there, sharp and unyielding. Her heart wrestled with itself, torn between the longing to be free and the undeniable truth that the walls of her world now moved with the pull of his presence, and so the nights grew longer. The silence of the old village thickened. Whispers carried through the wind, half-spoken fears that the tribe was drifting toward disaster. Still, no one dared to name what they suspected, that the leader's forbidden desire was tightening. Its grip, that his heart was straying not only from his wife, but from the tribe itself. And then came the night when the firelight flickered strangely, when even the stars seemed to hold their breath, and the weight of his choice could no longer be hidden. That night, when the village slept, and the moon cast its silver light across the wooden huts, the line between loyalty and lust, between love and ruin, was crossed. The silence broke. What happened within that fragile span of hours would echo through generations, turning into legend whispered by the old and feared by the young. For on that night, his desire for the white prisoner, stronger than his bond to his wife, stronger than his oath to his people, set in motion a chain of events that no prayer or chant could undo. And as dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, the tribe stirred to a world forever changed, though few yet understood just how deep the cracks had run. The echoes of that night would soon tear through the heart of the village, leaving behind a story too heavy to carry, too haunting to forget. The dawn that followed was quiet, but it was not the peace of rest. It was the heavy stillness that comes when something has shifted in the air, when the world senses change, though it cannot yet see its full shape. The people of the village rose from their huts, stretching stiff limbs, stirring their fires, and carrying water from the river. Children chased one another between the trees, and women bent over baskets of roots and dried corn. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of morning, an unease moved like a hidden current. They did not yet know what had happened, but they felt it. As if the earth itself had shifted in its sleep, the chief stepped from his hut with the same firm stride as always. His broad shoulders squared, his voice steady as he greeted the men who waited near the fire. To those who looked upon him, he seemed unchanged. His eyes, sharp and steady to the tribe, carried a flicker of something restless, something no council drum could silence. He had crossed the boundary of desire and duty, and now each step he took through the village ground was heavier than the last. His wife moved quietly that morning, her face composed, her hands busy with the tasks expected of her. Yet she felt the weight of her husband's absence, though he stood only a few paces away. It was not the distance of the body, but of the spirit. And she knew the bond that had held them for so long was fraying. She had seen it building over time, felt it like a storm rolling closer, and now she feared the storm had broken. Still, she did not speak, for she was bound by pride, by silence, and by the knowledge that her words would not call him back. She turned her face to the fire and worked in stillness. But her heart beat with dread. In the small hut at the edge of the village, the prisoner stirred as well. She had not slept, for her mind replayed the night in 100 fragments. She could still hear the chief's voice, low and urgent, could still feel the weight of his presence, the way his shadow had filled the small room. She did not understand. The man who came to her in silence and left before the world awoke. She feared him, yet she also felt a pull she could not deny. It was not love, not yet, but it was something that unsettled her more deeply than chains ever could. She pressed her hands against her face, trying to will away the confusion inside her. but no prayer she had ever whispered could undo the truth. The lines between prisoner and captor were blurring, and she was caught in the tangle. The tribe itself was a place bound by old rules, rules carved from hardship and survival. Each man and woman knew their place. Each child grew into the patterns of their ancestors, and every ritual held meaning too heavy to ignore. They survived because they honored these ways, because they trusted the chief to guide them without falter. But trust was fragile, and in the days that followed, cracks began to show. The hunts that once brought back deer and elk grew lean. Traps set in the forest yielded little. The river fish swam deep and silent, as though hiding from something unseen. The women muttered over their baskets, saying the land itself was restless. The elders beat their drums longer, their chants rising into the night air, seeking to steady what felt unsteady. But each failed hunt, each empty basket, fed the whispers that something was wrong. The chief heard the whispers, though no one dared speak them in his presence. He felt their eyes on him when he walked to the council fire, when he lifted his spear in ceremony, when he stood before them as the man meant to carry their strength. He knew they were watching for signs, for cracks, for weakness, and deep down he feared they would find it not in his arms, but in his heart. For he could not stop returning to the hut, could not stop seeking the presence of the prisoner, who had unsettled the core of his being. Each night he swore it would be the last, yet each night the fire inside him carried him back. The prisoner, for her part, began to sense the danger as well. She saw the way the women glanced at her there, suspicion sharper than knives. She noticed how the young warriors, proud and restless, looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and resentment, as if blaming her for some shadow they could not name. She did not wish for this attention, yet she could not stop the pull of it. She felt trapped not only by the walls of her hut, but by the invisible cords that tied her to the chief's gaze. The wife endured in silence, but her silence grew heavier each day. She prayed at the fire not for herself, but for her people, for she feared what would come if the truth ever rose to the surface. She knew her husband's strength, but she also knew his weakness now. And weakness in a leader was a wound that spread through the tribe. She watched him carefully, her heart torn between anger and sorrow. And she knew she was standing on the edge of something she could not stop. The elders, too, began to sense the shifting. They spoke in riddles, as old ones often did, warning of cracks in the spirit of the village. They said the tribe's strength lay in unity, that one man's weakness could become the downfall of many. Their eyes lingered on the chief longer than before, though their words did not name him. The council drums grew louder, echoing through the forest at night, as if trying to chase away an unseen shadow. But shadows do not leave when they are chased. They hide deeper, waiting for their moment, and the moment was drawing closer. Air of the village grew tense, as though the people held their breath. Every night, when the fires burned low, the chief felt the same restless pull, and every night he gave into it. The prisoner, weary and confused, could not untangle her own feelings. The wife, silent and watchful, held her sorrow like a stone in her chest. The tribe, whispering in the dark, felt the weight of change pressing upon them. It was not yet open. Conflict, not yet spoken truth. But it was coming. Like a storm building beyond the horizon, unseen but certain, it gathered with every heartbeat, with every step taken on soil that seemed to grow heavier beneath their feet. The forest listened. The river carried whispers. Even the animals stirred differently, restless in their movements. All things seemed to sense what the people could not yet admit, that the bond between chief and prisoner was no longer a secret. And when it broke into the open, it would break more than hearts. On one such night, when the moon was a thin silver edge and the fires had burned to embers, the chief stood at the doorway of the prisoner's hut, his shadow long against the ground. He hesitated, for the first time truly fearing the cost of the path he walked. His hand rested on the wooden frame, and he looked toward the sky as if seeking a sign. None came. Behind him the village slept. Before him the prisoner waited, her eyes wide with questions she could not speak. Between them hung a silence heavy as stone, a silence that would soon shatter, and when it did, it would not be only a man and a woman who paid the price it would be the tribe, the old ways, and the fragile balance of a world already trembling on the edge of change. The night stretched long, the air thick with unspoken words, and a cliff between desire and ruin grew sharper, steeper, impossible to cross without breaking. The chief stepped forward. The prisoner held her breath, and somewhere in the darkness, the wife stirred in her sleep, as if her spirit already knew that the storm was about to break. The days that followed seemed to drag the village into a quiet unrest. Like the heavy pause before a thunderstorm, the men still sharpened their spears, the women still wove baskets. The children still played by the riverbank, but there was an edge in the air that no one could deny. Even the birds that once filled the trees with sound now sang less, as if silenced by some unseen warning. The chief carried himself as though nothing was wrong, yet every glance, every whispered voice seemed to trail after him like shadows that would not let go. The prisoner felt those shadows as well. She was watched more closely now, not by guards, but by eyes filled with suspicion and unease. Each time she left her hut to fetch water or to breathe the cool air near the trees, she felt the weight of the tribe's gaze pressing down on her. She had become more than an outsider. She was a symbol of something the people could not name but feared. They had seen strangers before, but never had one drawn the heart of their leader into such dangerous silence. Her presence no longer seemed like an accident of fate, was beginning to feel like a curse whispered into their lives. The wife moved through these days with quiet strength, though inside she carried storms of her own. She rose early, worked hard, and spoke little, but her silence was not weakness. It was the silence of someone waiting, of someone who could see the ground shifting beneath her feet but did not yet know where it would break. She had stood beside her husband through many trials, through hunger, through loss, through years of carrying the tribe forward. But this was a wound she could not mend with prayers or patience. She felt the eyes of other women on her, their pity like daggers, their whispers sharp in the air. They wondered why she did not fight, why she did not speak. Yet she knew that the moment she gave voice to what everyone already suspected, the fire would spread beyond her control. Among the young warriors, unease began to harden into anger. They were men who had been raised to protect the tribe, to defend its honor against enemies seen and unseen. They did not speak openly against their chief, for tradition demanded loyalty, but loyalty was tested when the leader's heart strayed. Around the fire at night they muttered of omens and weakness, of the way the hunts failed, and the way the earth seemed to turn against them. They began to wonder if their strength was being wasted while their chief's mind wandered elsewhere. Some argued that the prisoner should be cast out, others that she should be silenced forever. Yet none dared to act without command, and so their anger smoldered, waiting for a spark. The elders, old as the roots of the trees, watched all of this. With eyes clouded by age but sharpened by wisdom, they did not speak rashly, but their murmurs carried warnings that crept into the hearts of the people. They spoke of balance, of how the strength of one man was tied to the strength of all, and how one weakness could unravel even the strongest bonds. They called for ceremonies, for offerings to the spirits. But beneath their words was a deeper fear, that no chant or sacrifice could undo what had already begun. They knew the story would not end with silence. In the quiet of her hut, the prisoner fought her own battles. She did not ask for the role she now held in the tribe's heart. She wanted freedom, yet freedom had become more distant with each passing night. The chief's presence bound her as tightly as the walls of her prison. She could not deny the strange pull she felt, but she also knew it was dangerous. She sensed the resentment of the women, the suspicion of the men, the sorrow of the wife. She had become a fracture in a world already struggling to hold itself together. Each time she heard footsteps near her door, she held her breath, not knowing if they belonged to the chief, to his wife, or to those who wished her gone. The chief himself lived in torment. By day, he bore the mask of strength, his voice steady, his stride firm, his presence unshaken. By night, the mask cracked, and the weight of his choices pressed upon him. He was a man torn in two, bound by duty to his wife, his people, and the old ways, yet pulled by desire towards something forbidden. He told himself he could balance both, that he could serve his people while chasing what his heart demanded. But deep within, he knew the truth. No man can serve two masters without breaking. He felt the eyes of the spirits upon him, their silence, heavier than their words would have been. The tension spread into every corner of the village. Mothers hushed their children when they asked questions. Warriors grew restless, their anger sharpening like blades.
Elders
Prayed longer into the night. The wife carried her sorrow with quiet dignity, but her silence was beginning to weigh too heavily. And through it all, the prisoner lived in the center, her every movement stirring ripples through the hearts of those around her. One evening, as the sun sank behind the forest and painted the sky in shades of fire, the young warriors gathered apart from the main fire. Their voices were low, but their anger was strong. They spoke of the hunts, of the empty traps, of the feeling that the land itself was turning against them. They spoke of the prisoner, of how her presence was twisting the heart of their leader. Some argued that the chief must be confronted, others that the prisoner must be removed before the tribe was torn apart. Their words grew sharp, but their loyalty still held them back. For now, meanwhile in the solitude of her hut, the wife prepared a quiet prayer. She lit a small fire, offered food to the spirits, and whispered words not for herself but for her people. She prayed that her husband would return to his strength, that the shadows would lift, the tribe would not break under the weight of his choices. Yet as the flames flickered and the smoke rose, she felt no answer. Only the heavy silence of the night. The prisoner lay awake, listening to the sounds of the village, the crackle of distant fires, the laughter of children fading into sleep, the mutters of men who refused to rest. She wondered if she would ever be free, or if freedom itself had already been taken from her by something deeper than chains. She felt caught in a web of desire and resentment, a web that grew tighter each day. She feared what might happen when it finally snapped. The chief walked alone that night, the moonlight casting his shadow long across the earth. He felt the pull of the hut, the same pull that had drawn him so many nights before. Yet he also felt the weight of his people, the weight of his wife's silence, the weight of his own conscience pressing harder than ever. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, torn between paths that could not both be walked. His heart beat heavy in his chest, and he knew that whatever choice he made would not belong to him alone. It would belong to the tribe, to the land, to the generations yet to come. And still, the night deepened. The fires burned low. The whispers grew sharper in the dark. The prisoner waited. The wife prayed. The warriors plotted. The elders listened. And the chief stood caught between worlds, his silence louder than any word he could speak. The storm had not yet broken, but it pressed closer with every heartbeat. The village held its breath, caught between desire and duty, love and ruin, silence and truth. And when the moment came, it would not be gentle, it would shatter everything they had known, leaving nothing untouched. The nights grew colder, and with them the village grew quieter, but it was not the quiet of peace. It was the silence of a people waiting, of hearts tightening against what they could feel, pressing closer. The fires no longer seemed to give warmth, and the laughter of children had dimmed to whispers. Even the drums of the elders, once strong and steady, now carried a tone of worry. Something unseen but undeniable coiled around the tribe, and all knew it was tied to the secret that lay between their chief and the white prisoner. The prisoner herself felt the change most sharply. Every step she took, whether toward the river or the edge of the forest, was followed by eyes that watched too closely. The women no longer hid their whispers. They turned their backs as she passed, their voices like knives carried by the wind. The young warriors, once merely curious, now looked at her with open hostility. They saw her as the root of their misfortunes, as the reason hunts failed, as the reason their leader seemed distant. She wanted no part of their world, yet her presence had become the center of it. Each night she lay awake, wondering if she would live to see the next sunrise. And each dawn that came felt like a reprieve she did not deserve. The wife bore her, suffering in silence, though silence was becoming unbearable. She had long been the symbol of strength among the women, a partner to her husband in leading their people, but now she felt herself fading into shadow. She saw the glances that passed between the others when she approached, felt their pity and judgment alike. They pitied her for the betrayal, judged her for her stillness. They wondered why she did not act, why she allowed the prisoner to remain. She carried the weight of their questions in her chest, knowing that one day she might be forced to answer. At night, when her husband returned with the scent of another's presence still clinging to him, she closed her eyes and fought the scream that burned in her throat. The chief himself lived like a man trapped between two fires. By day he stood before his people, his face carved into strength, his voice steady as stone. But every night the mask cracked, and the pull toward the prisoner dragged him deeper. He told himself he could balance it, that he could hold his tribe together while feeding the hunger inside him, but each step he took made the ground beneath him weaker. He knew he was losing control, yet the more he tried to turn away, the more he found himself drawn back. It was not simply desire now, it was something heavier, something he could not name but could not silence. The young warriors grew restless, their anger sharper with each passing day. They gathered in secret, their voices low but fierce. They spoke of the hunts that failed, of the signs in the forest, of the way their leaders' eyes strayed. They swore that the spirits were angry, that the tribe was being punished for the weakness of one man. Some demanded that the prisoner be taken from the village. Others whispered of darker measures. They were bound by loyalty still, but loyalty strained is loyalty near breaking. And as their tempers burned hotter, the risk of open defiance crept closer. The elders, wise but weary, felt the storm coming as surely as the shifting of the seasons. They prayed longer into the night, their chants rising against the wind. But even they began to wonder if prayer would be enough. The balance of the tribe was like a woven basket strung, only so long as every strand held firm. But with one strand unraveling, the whole risked falling apart. They feared that when the break came, it would not be small. It would tear the tribe into pieces too jagged to mend. The forest, too, seemed to sense what was coming. The river ran darker, its currents stronger. The animals moved strangely, their tracks circling where once they had passed cleanly through. The air carried a heaviness, and the night seemed endless. The people whispered of omens, of shadows in the trees, of voices carried on the wind. They looked to their leader for strength, but in their hearts, doubt had already begun to grow. One night, the tension finally began to crack. The warriors had returned empty-handed once more, their faces grim, their tempers hot, round the fire. Their muttering rose louder than before. The prisoner's hut was too close, and their words carried into her ears. She heard them speak of her as a curse, a poison, a burden they would no longer bear. She pressed herself against the wooden walls, heart pounding. Knowing that the safety she once found in the chief's presence was no longer enough, she was not safe from the tribe itself, not safe from the fire building in the hearts of those who resented her. The wife heard their voices too. She sat in silence by her own fire, her face still, but her heart heavy with the knowledge that the storm could no longer be held back. She had prayed, waited, and endured, but endurance had its end. She looked toward the prisoner's hut, and then toward her husband, who sat among the warriors, trying to quiet them with steady words. But she saw the truth in their eyes. His words no longer held the weight they once had. The bond between chief and tribe was fraying. The chief felt it, too. He stood among the men, his voice strong, but behind their silence, he felt their doubt. They no longer looked at him with the certainty of old. Their eyes shifted, their mouths tightened. Loyalty was still there, but it was cracked, fragile, ready to shatter. He would not lose them, yet he also knew he could not give up what his heart demanded. He was torn, his every step leading him closer to the edge of ruin. That night, when the fires had burned low and the village slept, the chief returned once more to the prisoner's hut. His steps were heavy, his breath uneven. He stood at the doorway, the moonlight casting long shadows, and for a moment he hesitated. He felt the weight of his people, the weight of his wife's silence, the weight of his own choices pressing harder than ever. But the pull was too strong, and once again he stepped inside. The prisoner met his eyes, her own filled with fear, and something she could not name, and the silence between them was heavier than words. Unseen. In the shadows beyond the hut, two young warriors watched. They had followed him, their suspicion now confirmed. They saw their leader, the man meant to carry their people, stepping into the very weakness they had feared. Their anger burned, but so too did their fear, for they knew what this meant. The tribe stood at the edge of destruction, and the choice of one man could bring them all down. They slipped away into the night, their minds already racing with what must be done. The next day, the whispers spread faster. The warriors did not speak openly, but their silence carried more than words. The women muttered more boldly, their eyes sharp with judgment. The elders' chants grew louder, but behind their voices trembled doubt. The prisoner felt the storm pressing closer with every glance, every muttered word, every shadow that fell too near her hut. She knew that something would soon break, and when it did, no one would be safe, not her, not the wife, not even the chief himself. The wife felt it as well. Her silence had become a blade turned inward, and she knew she could not remain still much longer. She had borne the weight of her husband's betrayal, the weight of the people's whispers, the weight of her own sorrow. But all burdens have their end. Her eyes now carried only warning. A warning he seemed too blind to see. The chief walked through the village that day with his head high. But inside him he felt the walls closing in. His people no longer looked at him as they once had, and he no longer felt the strength he once carried. Every path led to ruin, yet he could not stop. He was caught in the grip of something stronger than duty, stronger than reason, stronger even than love itself. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was here, gathering in the whispers, in the shadows, in the eyes of every man, woman, and child in the village. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when silence would shatter, and as the sun dipped below the trees and the fires were lit, that moment crept closer, unseen but certain. The wife's silence had grown into steel. The prisoner's fear had hardened into dread. The warrior's anger had sharpened into resolve. The elder's chants trembled with warning, and the chief, torn between all of it, stood at the edge of a night that would decide the fate of them all. The village was no longer simply restless. It was ready to break. And when it did, the clash would be louder than any drum, fiercer than any storm, and more final than any prayer. The night of the breaking finally came, though no one could say afterward exactly when it began. Perhaps it was when the drums of the elders slowed, their hands too heavy to lift against the storm that had long been building. Perhaps it was when the warriors, their patience worn thin, let their anger spill from whispers into action. Or perhaps it began in the silence of the wife's heart, when she could no longer bear the shadow that had fallen across her marriage, her tribe, and her own soul. However it began, by the time the moon reached its highest point, the village was already unraveling. The warriors who had seen the chief enter, the prisoner's hut could not hold their silence any longer. They gathered the others, their words like sparks in dry grass. By the firelight they spoke of betrayal, of weakness, of the curse that hung over them all. Their voices rose higher until the elders themselves could no longer still them with chants or wisdom. It was not only anger now, but desperation. Desperation born of hunger, of fear, of a trust that had been broken too many times in too short a span. The wife stood among the women, her face pale in the flickering glow. She listened to the warriors' voices, to the mutters of the mothers, to the restless cries of children who felt the unease pressing down on their world. For the first time, she did not keep her silence. She stepped forward, her voice steady, and spoke the truth that had been buried too long. She told them all that what they feared was real, that their leader had given his heart not to his people, nor to her, but to the prisoner who had been thrust among them. She did not speak in anger, though her heart had every right to it. She spoke with the sorrow of one who knew the wound could not be hidden any longer. The tribe listened, and a murmur spread through the crowd. Some cried out in rage, others in grief, still others in shock. The prisoner's hut was no longer just a hut. It was a symbol of everything that divided them. Men gripped their spears tighter, women drew their children closer, and the elders shook their heads with eyes that had already seen too many endings. The chief emerged then, drawn by the noise, his shadow long and heavy against the firelight. His face carried no fear, only the weight of a man who knew there was no path left to walk but forward. He looked at his people, his warriors, his elders, his wife, his prisoner, and for a long moment he said nothing. But silence is not strength when the hearts of others are breaking. The warriors demanded answers. The women demanded justice. The wife demanded truth. And the prisoner, standing pale and trembling, demanded nothing at all, for she knew her fate was no longer her own. Finally, the chief spoke. His words were steady, but they carried no defense. He admitted what all had suspected, admitted that he had given his heart to one who did not belong to them, admitted that he had strayed from the path he had sworn to walk. He did not beg for forgiveness, nor did he claim innocence. He only told them what he felt, what he could not deny, and he stood waiting for their judgment. The tribe erupted into cries. Some called for his removal, some for the prisoner's blood, some for the wife's honor to be restored. The elders raised their hands, urging calm. But calm was no longer possible. The air was thick with anger, grief, and betrayal. The fire crackled as if feeding on the storm of voices, sending sparks into the night sky. The prisoner stepped forward then, her voice trembling but clear. She told them she had never asked for this fate, never sought to divide them, never wished to be the cause of their sorrow. She said she wanted only freedom, a life beyond the walls of the hut, a chance to be more than a shadow of another's choices. Her words cut through the noise, but they did not heal the wound. To some, her plea sounded like truth. To others, it sounded like poison. It was the wife who stilled the crowd again. She stood tall, her dignity unbroken, even as her heart lay in pieces. She told the tribe that anger would not mend what had been broken, that violence would not restore their strength. She said the choice lay not in the destruction of one life or another, but in deciding what kind of people they wished to be. Words calm and steady carried a weight that even the warriors could not ignore. The elders seized that moment, their voices rising together in a chant that had carried the tribe through countless storms. They called for judgment not in blood, but in exile. The chief, they said, could no longer lead, for his heart had strayed too far. The prisoner, too, could not remain, for her presence would forever be a reminder of division. Together, they must leave, bound not as leader and captive, but as outcasts whose choices had broken the balance of the tribe. The words struck the chief like a spear to the chest. But he did not protest. He looked to his wife, his eyes heavy with sorrow, and she looked back with neither hatred nor forgiveness, only finality. Their bond, once unshakable, had been cut by his own hand. He turned then to the prisoner, and she met his gaze with fear and uncertainty. She had not asked for this path, but now she was bound to it. By morning, it was done. The chief and the prisoner left the village together, walking into the forest as the tribe watched in silence. No one followed, no one spoke. The trees swallowed their figures until they were gone, leaving behind only the smoke of dying fires, and the echo of choices that could not be undone. The wife stood alone, yet not broken. She carried herself with quiet strength, becoming a symbol not of betrayal, but of resilience. The tribe turned to her in the days that followed, for though she was not chief, her voice carried the weight of survival. The young warriors bent there, anger into duty once more. Elders guided them back into balance. Slowly the tribe began to heal. Though scars remained in every heart, the prisoner's fate beyond the forest was never known. Some whispered she found her people again, others that she perished in the wilderness. The chief's fate was likewise lost to the trees. Some believed he carved a life of his own, others that the spirits claimed him for the weakness he could not control. Their story became a warning, a tale told by fireside to children who grew wide-eyed at the mention of desire stronger than duty, of weakness stronger than tradition. For the tribe, the lesson was clear. A leader's heart belongs not to himself, but to his people. A single desire can shatter more than a home. It can unravel the very bonds that hold a community together. The story lived on, not as gossip, not as pity, but as a reminder of the cost of straying from the path, and the wife, though marked by sorrow, endured. Her silence, once seen as weakness, became her strength. She taught the women that dignity is not in words, but in the way one carries the weight of loss. She taught the warriors that anger must bend into protection, not destruction. The children that every choice carries a shadow, that some shadows never fade. The village did not forget the night when silence shattered, but neither did it collapse. It stood, scarred but standing, its people bound more tightly by the memory of what had been lost. The drums beat again, not with fear, but with rhythm steady as the heartbeat of the earth. The fires burned brighter, warming hearts that had grown cold, and though the prisoner and the chief had vanished into the wilderness, their story remained forever in the soil. The river, the trees, a story of love and ruin, of lust and loyalty, of the fragile line between strength and weakness. In time, when the children asked why the elders told the story so often, the answer was always the same: so they would remember. So they would know that even the strongest can fall, that even love can destroy, and that the true strength of a people lies not in one man's desire, but in the unity of many hearts bound together. And so the tale ended. Not with victory, not with triumph, but with memory. A memory carried forward through generations, whispered in the old American village whenever the night grew too quiet and the firelight too dim. A memory of the man who loved his white prisoner more than his wife, and of the night when his lust shattered the tribe,